Our digestive system is the way that we're able to now provide nutrition to our body. So the source of energy from carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, vitamin, water, whatnot. So it all starts with, the source of our diet. So the foods that we consume. And that's what I'm having here on this intro screen, just a bunch of different foods that I've eaten, of course, in the past. And even I've been to this restaurant in particular here. So we'll go ahead and move forward. So seeing the functions for this organ system, well, the term digestion, just breaking apart and breaking down the source of food. So whatever, again, is in our diet, the foods that we choose to eat. We have structures involved in just physically breaking apart the food because we can't absorb a hamburger, but we can absorb, of course, the sugar, fat, and protein. So we have to just physically break apart the material. So your teeth, of course, are one important structure involved in the mechanical processing, along with our stomach. And then there's also now the enzymatic activity. So the chemical digestion that occurs. So you could think of just with the saliva and the enzymes in the saliva, stomach acids. So we have both the mechanical and chemical digestion of the material we ingest. There's now a large amount, of course, muscular activity, both skeletal and smooth muscle, because, of course, we put food into our mouth. That's the entrance for the system. The proximal end is at the oral cavity. But now there's a large degree of muscular activity to move material ultimately through the length of our digestive tract. So that proximal end is the oral cavity, the mouth, and the distal end of the canal is at the rectum and anus. And in terms of this muscular activity, a term for that, the propulsion of material through the length of our digestive canal, this is termed peristalsis, and we'll come back to that muscular activity and a second type as well. With the production of enzymes, the chemical digestion, well, there's numerous structures that now produce and ultimately excrete. So the release of these enzymes from your salivary glands, for example, your pancreas, and ultimately all of these enzymes and digestive factors have to enter into the open canal, the lumen of our digestive tract, and there they can act upon the various nutrients that we consume. So with these first 3 points, just the physical and chemical digestion of food, the muscular activity to propel material through our digestive tract, the production of enzymes all throughout. Ultimately, these first 3 now allow for the proper breakdown to the point where we could absorb the nutrition. And ultimately, the nutrients get into our bloodstream, and now we could circulate those nutrients to all of our tissues. So the digestive system, we're going to divide it into these 2 different components. So what's known as the alimentary canal or a gastrointestinal tract. This is now essentially the canal that runs from the oral cavity. So again, this is the proximal end. And then there's a series of structures. This is just a general diagram for now, and we'll add in the details for each of these segments. And then ultimately the rectum now is at the distal end. And this would be an area where we use the terms proximal versus distal, the length of our digestive tract. So of course, food is passing through this canal. And again, there's muscular activity to propel the material through the length of the canal. And we'll definitely talk about areas that have smooth muscle versus skeletal muscle. And you notice the length of this canal here, most of which is found in the area of the small intestines, is the longest section. So we'll work our way through the tubing and we'll see the structure of that tube, the various segments. And now a second portion, what's considered the accessory organs. Food is passing through the length of our alimentary canal, whereas the accessory organs, they do not have that same function. So some of them are found completely outside of the gastrointestinal tract. Other ones have various duct structures that lead, of course, into that. So the pancreas is outside of the digestive tract, but there are various duct structures. So the pancreas can secrete its various digestive juices. And then other structures are found actually inside of the canal. They're not a part of the wall of the tubing, but for example, the teeth and the tongue, those are located inside our mouth, of course, but again, not a part of the structure of this tube. So we'll finish up at the end with the accessory organs. So we want to start with the top section, the gastrointestinal tract. And all throughout our digestive tract, there are 4 layers. And keep in mind, this is a hollow tube running from one end, your oral cavity, all the way to another end, the rectum. So it is this hollow canal running through our body. And for this purpose, the superficial portion of the organ, the exposed superficial surface, is actually the inner side of the tube. So we have this little diagram here, the tunica mucosa. Anytime we see this word tunica, it always means a layer. So this tunic or this layer, it's the mucosal layer. We'll talk about the tissues involved in this area, but this is the exposed superficial surface. And a simple way to understand this is you could easily, reach inside of your mouth and touch the inside of your cheek. So it is exposed at the surface, even though it's internally inside of your mouth. And the same applies for your stomach, your intestines. It is truly that exposed superficial end. And a little sketch. If you make a little cylinder that's open, again, you could get that idea. You could always just reach and touch to the inside of the tube since it's a hollow tunnel. So now actually moving deeper into the tissue, now penetrating the tissue, the second layer is the tunica submucosa. The third layer, tunica muscularis, and quite commonly the word externa here is dropped. So just simply tunica muscularis. And now the fourth tunic, this is where we see some variation for the fourth tunic's name. If we're inside of the abdominal cavity, so any of the GI tract that's in the abdominal cavity, it will have this name, tunica serosa, which is also another name for the visceral peritoneum. That serous membrane bonded to this case to organs. But that's only the case for the abdominal cavity. So whereas organs that are not in the abdominal cavity, and a great example is your esophagus. Your esophagus is part of the GI tract, but it's not in the abdominal cavity. We'll see that this fourth tunic has a different name and a different structure. So again, serosa only applies to the GI components that are in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So here's now a textbook figure. We can see the tubing here, in this case, the intestines, and taking a look at the wall of the intestines and zooming in, we see from the superficial internal surface, there's the first tunica mucosa, and then the deeper second layer, submucosa. The third layer again, tunica muscularis would suffice. And again, since this is a view of the intestines, and the intestines are definitely located in the abdominal cavity, it's correct to call it serosa or visceral peritoneum for the intestines. So with these 4 general layers, we'll start to point out now the traits of each of these. But keep in mind there's variation from different sections of the GI tract. The esophagus is very different from the stomach, which is different from the small intestines and so forth. So in general, the superficial tunica mucosa, well, this does function as a mucous membrane. So what's meant here is this is a layer of epithelial tissue. Deep to the epithelial tissue is a layer of connective tissue. And whenever we have that arrangement, epithelial tissue with deeper connective tissue, that is the structure of a membrane. And in this case, this membrane is covered in a coating of protective mucus, hence the name. So a mucus-covered membrane, a mucous membrane. And we'll touch on the importance of this mucus coming up soon. Another trait of the tunica mucosa is in many different areas, it has a very convoluted and folded surface. So we'll talk about structures called plica or villi. But having that folding at the surface, one of the major benefits is it increases contact surface area. So there's just simply more tissue for the ingested material to come into contact with, as opposed to if the layer was completely smooth. So now the second layer, the tunica mucosa. So this is an area made of, you notice once again, connective tissue. There's a lot of loose connective tissue, but there's some degree of dense connective tissue as well in this area. And one principal trait about the tunica submucosa, in some cases, but certainly not all, this is where we find various glands. So glands that are producing the various enzymes for chemical digestion. So it could be a source of that enzymatic activity coming from the glands that may be present in this area, but it's not always the case. The third general layer, the tunica muscularis. This is now an exception when it comes to the stomach. Most areas only have 2 layers of muscles, whereas the stomach gets that third additional layer. So that's the additional strength and contraction that could occur in the stomach. And another typical trait is the 2 layers, or 3 in the case of the stomach, it's usually smooth muscle in most locations. However, we will point out some exceptions where it can have skeletal muscle. So that is a possibility as well. And we'll point out the distinct areas that actually have skeletal muscle, but typically it's smooth muscle throughout most of the digestive tract. And then here we are in the fourth layer again, the tunica serosa. And again, as we have already said, this is the case of the naming and structure when it comes to areas that are in the abdominal cavity. So tunica serosa, or a visceral peritoneum. Again, we've been discussing serous membranes now since the first day of class. So that fluid secreting protective membrane in this case directly bonded on to the intestines, for example. So it is the surface of the organ. However, the exception would be now organs that are outside of the abdominal cavity. The esophagus is located in the mediastinum. The rectum is located in the pelvic cavity. So for areas that are not in the abdominal cavity, the name would be tunica adventitia. And the tunica adventitia for the rectum or for the esophagus, this is not, it is not a serous membrane. It's not a fluid producing membrane. Now it's within the tunica muscularis externa, especially of the digestive tract. Again, in most areas, there's smooth muscle. So we want to take a look at this in particular, but again, it's not the only type of muscle ever found. So the tunica muscularis is now responsible for two major types of contraction that occurs within the gastrointestinal tract. And the first one we mentioned, peristalsis, as well as segmentation. And let's take a look at these two types of motility. So peristalsis, as we mentioned from the beginning, this is now a wave of muscular activity that ultimately is going to propel material that we ingest through the length of the digestive tract in the direction of the rectum. So this is our ability to put food in our mouth and swallow it down our pharynx and esophagus and move it through the length of the digestive tract. And this figure here, you notice, is showing that. So starting from the beginning, right, with food entering into the mouth, and it's that muscular activity, again, from the tunica muscularis. And over time, that wave of contraction, you can see here, is propelling this bolus of food, this clump of ingested matter, and again, ultimately moving it through the length of the digestive tract. Whereas now a second and very important type of muscular activity is segmentation. So segmentation now, instead of propelling material through the length of the tract, again, that's the activity of peristalsis, segmentation is now involved in just physically now digesting and breaking up the food, especially as just simply mixing it and exposing it now in close contact with the various acids and enzymes, that chemical digestion elements. So we have this second figure over here illustrating segmentation. So we can notice here this larger bolus of food and segmentation to mix and churn and break it down. And ultimately you can see that we're now just physically separating the material into smaller and smaller bits. And again, the mixing activity helps to bring the material into contact with the various enzymes. So we rely on both of these activities and we alternate between these two. Peristalsis for a period of time will propel material through a certain distance of the digestive tract. And then we can have a period of segmentation, especially within the stomach. So to mix and break down the material in the stomach. And then another period of peristalsis to propel it from the stomach towards the intestines. So we rely on both of these muscular activities. And just an interesting note here, what's known as the enteric nervous system. This is now a large network of digestive reflexes. There's a huge number of neurons that ultimately respond to and help to stimulate all of this visceral motor function that's occurring within the digestive system. In fact, the digestive system, this enteric nervous system, is truly a third part of the visceral motor division. There's a lot of talk about sympathetic, parasympathetic, but really just wanted to mention the enteric nervous system as well. So now we have the idea of this four-tunic layered canal, starting on the proximal end with the oral cavity and about 30 feet in tubing. Later, we end up at the anus. So we're just going to start at the oral cavity. And again, this is a very important area for the physical breakdown of the food. And we also start the chemical digestion with our saliva. So we'll enter into the mouth and we'll discuss salivary glands, a quick look at the teeth, and then we'll continue down. So starting with the salivary glands again, there's various sets of salivary glands that we'll see from the lab. Good example of a mixed exocrine gland. So both that mucus and serous secretion, the thick mucus, the watery serous secretion. And this is now stimulated by our parasympathetic, that visceral motor division, specifically parasympathetic nerves, will stimulate the salivary gland function. You want to think of the facial nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve. And to aid in chemical digestion, the salivary glands produce enzymes to break down sugar and fat. So again, this chemical digestion starts right in the mouth. And other functions beyond just the enzymatic activity. It's a lubricant for the mouth in general, the tissue, your gingivae, the gums. Saliva helps to protect the teeth, and saliva is essential for our ability to taste. We need that moisture. And we could just omit this last bullet point here. So multiple functions, of course, for the saliva. Taking a look at the teeth, it's a great example of how anatomy and physiology, right, the structure and function going together. So we have different shapes, different anatomical structures. And of course, that variation in shape, each has now their various functions that we'll get to. And the teeth, of course, are connected to our mandible and maxilla. However, teeth are really distinct from bone tissue. There is a similarity between the deep internal portion of the tooth, known as dentin, and just depending on your addition, you may see dentin with or without an E at the end. But in any case, this dentin, this is the deep internal portion of the tooth, and it is similar to the calcium-rich matrix of bone tissue. But of course, there's several differences between typical bones and our teeth. So multiple differences to make teeth unique. Another reference to the skeletal system. So that type of fibrous joint, that only example for the gomphosis joints, or the connection between the teeth and the sockets of the mandible and maxilla. And taking a look at, again, their shape and location, we have our relatively sharper teeth up front in the anterior portion. So these relatively, for human, sharper teeth. And that shape helps us to bite into something, to really tear into, say, a piece of steak. Whereas the wider, flatter teeth that are more posterior, these teeth, of course, allow us to just adequately now mash up the material. So as the food mixes with saliva and we're able to really pulverize it with our molars and premolars, we could just really mash up the food, and that prepares it now for swallowing. Quick look, of course, at the various sets of teeth. So we have what we commonly call our baby teeth, so deciduous teeth. And early in life, we only develop 20 deciduous teeth. Whereas now these teeth, of course, fall out. And just a quick reference, you notice here the primary teeth, the deciduous teeth, you can see here in the jaw. And now deeper inside, the secondary adult dentition are developing within. And ultimately, as these teeth grow, that'll help to displace and lead to the loss of our primary teeth. So these 20 teeth will be replaced, but also there's now 12 new teeth that grow in as well. So starting with the 20, adding in 12 new teeth. So a little toddler would have no premolars, does not have their wisdom teeth, and that takes the number up to a total of 32 adult teeth that can develop. Whereas now, lastly, just the term wisdom teeth. Wisdom teeth are just simply the very posterior four molars, these same four right here that are missing from young children. And just a quick look back at that here. So the third molar, and again, there's one on each side, right and left, superior and inferior rows. So those later teeth that grow in, referred to as the wisdom teeth. Okay, just the third molars. So taking a look at the process of swallowing, of course, the jaw itself is controlled by skeletal muscle. Right? The temporalis, masseter muscles, for example, control the elevation of the mandible. And swallowing starts with skeletal muscle as a voluntary function. And as we transition, of course, now from the mouth to pharynx, moving now down the throat, we have this ability, and this is, of course, a reflexive function, to temporarily close off the respiratory, the breathing passages, just in that brief moment when we're swallowing. And you can notice here how the nasal cavity and the nasopharynx, that becomes closed off to prevent material from entering into our nose, as well as the trachea, the airway here at the larynx, is also capped and closed over, once again to prevent choking. So once we close off the respiratory passage, just in this very short term, the only way for the food to go, and where we want it to go, is to the esophagus, to continue to the digestive tract. So that puts us at this next major area of the esophagus. And just what's noteworthy to point out here is the third tunic, so that tunica muscularis of the esophagus, it transitions the type of muscle tissue. So at the superior edge of the esophagus, the tunica muscularis for that superior, you notice 1/3. This is one of these areas that contains skeletal muscle in the tunica muscularis. So there's two layers of skeletal muscle in the superior, or often just called upper esophagus. Whereas as we transition down the length of the esophagus, the upper portion will have skeletal muscle. However, once we then transition down to the inferior end of the esophagus, the tunica muscularis would have smooth muscle. So one example of the variation of tissue in the tunica muscularis. Also, we're outside of the abdominal cavity. So instead of having a tunica serosa, again, that would not be present for the esophagus. Instead, it contains a tunica adventitia. And the esophagus, of course, is this connection between the pharynx, right, our throat, leading into the stomach. And that's what we see here, this next section of the stomach. So now we're within the abdominal cavity. The stomach on its surface will have a tunica serosa on its surface. And we'll take a look at here some of the unique traits. So within the stomach, again, the tunica muscularis, this is now completely smooth muscle tissue. And this is the one area that'll have 3 distinct layers of smooth muscle, longitudinal, circular, and oblique. 3 distinct layers of smooth muscle tissue. And this is the only location that has that additional third layer. The oblique layer is the additional layer unique to the stomach. So with this extra thick layer of muscle, the stomach could have stronger, more powerful contractions. And again, the stomach, along with the mouth, these are 2 areas involved in the mechanical digestion of food. So just physically breaking apart with our strong, rigid, enamel-covered teeth, as well as physically breaking apart food, mechanically digesting it with the 3 powerful contracting layers of our stomach. Going back to the tunica mucosa, we said early on, in many areas, the tunica mucosa has some degree of folding. And in this case of the stomach, the large folds are called rugae. They are a temporary structure, however. When the stomach is contracted down, so when the stomach's empty and contracted down, we get these big ridges, these large rugae, and these allow for the stomach to expand. So when the stomach fills, when it's stretching up and expanding, filling with food, the rugae then flatten out, and I always compare it to an accordion. You know, if you compress the ends of an accordion together, or a concertina, that instrument as well, you see the ridges in the center, and when you expand it out, these rugae would flatten out and allow for the expansion of the stomach. Getting back to the 4 tunic layers, here we have it spelled out again. So the mucus-covered tunica mucosa, which is very important for the stomach. The second deep layer, the tunica submucosa. Again, that third layer, the tunica muscularis externa. And again, we point out 3 layers unique to the stomach. And then we're in the abdominal cavity, the 4th layer, now correctly known as a serosa. So starting at the internal surface, the tunica mucosa, the importance now of this mucus membrane, the mucus-covered membrane in this case, the mucus is a protective barrier. It's coating right on the surface of the epithelial tissue. And having that mucus secretion, this helps to protect the tissue of the stomach. The tunica mucosa is being protected from the stomach's own acid, as well as, and then more importantly, the enzymes that are produced. So the secretions from the stomach, and we'll just quickly take a look at what's called a gastric gland. These gastric glands that have both chief cells and parietal cells are a source of either the enzyme or the stomach acid. And if left unchecked, the acid that's secreted can actually eat away and damage the tissue of the stomach itself. That's what's known as a gastric ulcer. So having a coating of mucus, that mucus really serves as a barrier coating on the tissue, and the mucus will protect the stomach from its own acidic secretions and its own enzymes as well. So ultimately, material that's now going to leave the stomach and pass on to the small intestines. This material is highly acidic and is referred to as acid chyme. And we'll see that the intestines as well needs to be protected from this incoming acid. And just a final description, also part of the gastric cells, there's now these G cells. And we're just going to mention it's a source of a hormone. So our stomach is an endocrine, a hormone producing organ. We don't have to worry about the function of these hormones, just naming where they come from. So now distal to the stomach, we move into the small intestines. This is the longest segment of the gastrointestinal tract. And we see here, this is where the majority of nutrients are being absorbed in the small intestines, specifically the midsection known as the jejunum of the small intestines. So that major site for nutrient absorption. Getting back to the tunica mucosa. So the tunica mucosa, that superficial surface. This is where we see now a high degree of surface area from the folding. So the ridge pattern that's seen within the surface of the tunica mucosa. And it has both these very large folds known as plicae. Branching off of the plica are the villi, and directly connected, a part of each epithelial cell, microvilli. So this in total greatly increases surface area, that contact surface between the contents of our small intestines and the tissue. And all of these help to boost, of course, the absorption. There's just more contact area, more surface area, and better absorption. And we'll see a figure in just a moment for all of these, so we could visualize that. Again, more hormones produced by the small intestines, and don't worry about learning the full name. So CCK will suffice, and secretin. So again, showing that hormonal function of the small intestines. And the latter 2 points for now, we'll see. There's what's known as a lacteal. This is a structure of the lymphatic system along with your spleen and tonsils. And there's a distinct type of lymphatic capillary that's found in our intestines, and it's used for the absorption of fat. And once we study the lymphatic system, we'll come back to this topic here. So whereas sugar, protein will be absorbed, of course, into our bloodstream, fat has this additional step first, this unique lacteal, and transmission through the lymphatic system. And again, we left off with the stomach, describing how that acid chyme, that highly acidic material of the stomach, is going to pass into the small intestines. And there's once again a mucous membrane, as well as direct pH buffers that are being secreted into the small intestines. And this helps to protect the tissue of our small intestines from that incoming acid chyme. So whereas our stomach and our intestines are protected by this acid, the problem, of course, is with heartburn, right? Acid reflux. If we have what's called reverse peristalsis, or just simply as we vomit, stomach acid moves in the proximal direction, and that stomach acid can do damage to the esophagus, the pharynx, the mouth, the gums, the teeth, all of which do not have sufficient acid protection. Taking a look at the small intestines, we have the three sections spelled out here. So the first initial section, distal to the stomach, and this could be pronounced as duodenum or duodenum. So these first few inches, however, a very, very important part of the gastrointestinal tract. The reason being is contents from the stomach flow into the duodenum. So the acid chyme and material from the stomach flows into the duodenum, but also various enzymes, and that's what's meant by digestive juices, various enzymes, pH factors, whatnot, flow from multiple organs, such as the gallbladder, the pancreas, the liver, and they all flow into the duodenum as well. So the incoming material from our stomach is met with so many other enzymes and pH factors. So there's a large amount of chemical digestion. A large amount of chemical digestion occurs in the duodenum. And now, as we pointed out, the next section, the jejunum, this is now the major area for absorption of nutrients. And then ultimately now passing into the longest section of the small intestines, known as the ileum. And the color coding can show this well. The jejunum versus the ileum, looking at the different shades here. And collectively, of course, this makes the length of the small intestines, which you notice is just about 21 feet in length. So all of that adequate absorption with the plica, the villi, the microvilli, and just simply the length of the tubing allows for all of this nutrient absorption. One final trait, there's what's known as a Peyer's patch. And this is a collection of white blood cells, embedded in our intestines. And this is a major feature of specifically the distal end of the small intestines, the ileum portion. So getting back to the tunica mucosa and its folding, again, you can notice here the very large ridges known as a plica, and branching off of them, the numerous spikes of villi. And zooming in on an individual villus, here's where that term, the lacteal, came from. So that distinct capillary that's absorbing fat, absorbed into that lacteal, that distinct lymphatic capillary. And also the term here, Peyer's patch, or also simply known as a lymphoid nodule. Again, a collection of white blood cells embedded in the wall of the intestines. Again, being much more common, larger in size, and more common for the ileum of the small intestines. And then lastly, just with the small intestines, you notice we're back to having just 2 layers, the usual case, 2 layers of smooth muscle once again. So now at the end of our gastrointestinal tract, the final structure is where we now reach the large intestines, and that's the view here. You notice distal to the ileum leads right into the large bowel or the large intestines. And the name, you notice, comes from the diameter as opposed to the length. So it's a shorter section in terms of length, but a bigger, larger size to the diameter. Whereas we've already done a large amount of nutrient absorption in the small intestines, here, especially what's important is the reabsorption of water. So anytime we secrete enzymes, it occurs in a fluid medium, a fluid mechanism of release, and that fluid's entering into the lumen of the GI tract, and it's now at the point of the large intestines, we're now going to recover that fluid. So water that's still within the area of the large intestines gets transferred into the cardiovascular system, and we're reabsorbing more water, pulling water out from the colon, and the remaining material becomes, of course, more rigid, more firm with that loss of water, and then ultimately material that we cannot chemically digest, we can't absorb and extract nutrients from, that ends up being excreted as waste matter. And just a closer look at the end of the canal, the area of the rectum. This is used for temporary storage of fecal matter. And then ultimately, at the very end of the canal, we have the various anal sphincters. And once again, here's an example of where we find skeletal muscle. So again, that voluntary control ultimately regulating this orifice, this opening. So we've worked our way through the length of the alimentary canal, but we now want to mention that it's now broken apart into various sections via valves. So at different junction points of that long GI tract, it's not just simply a long, hollow, open tunnel in our body, but there's multiple valves that now compartmentalize each portion. So here we're pointing out just the various junction points, and for some of them, we're learning the name of the valve. So we can start at the superior end, between the pharynx, the throat, and the esophagus. There is a valve structure we're not concerned with. You have to learn the name there. From the inferior side of the esophagus leading to the stomach is what's known as a cardiac sphincter. And when there's issues with that cardiac sphincter opening, that could lead to that acid reflux and damage to the esophagus. So it's commonly called heartburn, that cardiac sphincter. On the opposite end of the stomach, the distal end between stomach and small intestines is what's known as a pyloric sphincter. So hopefully these two sphincters are functioning and they're closed tightly, and the stomach with that additional third layer of muscle could do its powerful contractions without the loss of any of that acid. Of course, at the appropriate time, the pyloric sphincter will open, allow for passage of material from the stomach to the small intestines. And now between the small intestines and the large intestines, we have what's called the ileocecal valve. The ileum is the distal part of the small intestines, is the ileum. The proximal portion of the large intestines is called cecum. So where ileum and cecum meet, that name makes sense there, ileocecal valve. And again, we were just referencing the previous figure, and we're seeing that there is skeletal muscle regulating that, again, final sphincter for the pathway. And that's what we've now done, is we moved from the mouth and we follow the process of peristalsis, just moving through. Of course, there would be segmentation in the stomach for a period of time, and peristalsis moving on through the area of the small intestines, all that lengthening and tubing, and continuing on through the large intestines. So now we want to take a look at the accessory organs for this system, and we have them highlighted here: the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas are the ones that we want to focus on for now. And just a quick look at the blurb: secretion of bile that's used for lipid digestion, storage of nutrients, and truly the liver has hundreds of functions, absolute vital organ. The gallbladder is now simply for storage and concentration of the very same bile that was produced by the liver. So truly a storage pouch for the bile. And the pancreas here, a very important organ in terms of our chemical digestion. So multiple digestive enzymes, also various pH buffers and other factors produced by the pancreas. So another absolutely vital organ. So beginning with the liver, we're just going to look at three general groupings of the liver's function. So in terms of metabolic regulation, again, the storage and breakdown of all types of nutrients that our body could process. So sugar, fat, and protein. After being absorbed through the intestines, that blood is then shuttled to the liver, and then we further complete the metabolic process. We could detoxify our blood using the cells of the liver. So metabolic regulation is really the detoxification and the continued metabolism of all types of nutrients once they reach the liver. So that's a very broad category. The second major function for the liver is it has a large impact on the makeup of our blood. And that's what's meant by hematological, the impact on regulating several factors about the makeup of our connective tissue called blood. So the liver is an organ that receives a very rich blood supply. And later on, we'll discuss the capillaries, a very unique type of capillary that's found in the liver. So it has a lot of interaction with the blood. This is an area where we actually recycle and break down the cells of our blood, and producing a huge majority of the proteins that are in our blood's plasma. So in this case, again, just regulating many factors and makeup of our blood, that fluid connective tissue. And this final third grouping for function, here it is as we brought up earlier. The liver is the source of producing what's called bile and bile salts. So both of these materials. And we see that it's now the bile salts. This is now what really aids in the breakdown of fat. And bile also now helping us to neutralize incoming stomach acid. And both of these are being secreted into the small intestines. So that incoming stomach acid from the stomach, that acid chyme, and as these are secreted into the small intestines, that'll help us to counteract that incoming stomach acid and then ultimately aids in the breakdown of the fat. So here we're seeing a connection between the blood supply of the gastrointestinal tract. So we want to think of the stomach and the intestines. And now the liver. So again, the source of nutrients is coming into our GI tract, our gastrointestinal tract. We're able to mechanically and chemically digest the food to the point where we absorb it. And now the blood that transfers from the stomach and intestines, it'll pass through what's called an hepatic portal vein. And the blood circulating through this vein is now rich in nutrients from the food we consumed, possibly any toxins that we've ingested as well. And this blood vessel is the connection between the GI tract, and we're now delivering that blood to the liver. And again, this blood could be rich in nutrients from the food we consumed, possibly with any toxins. And now the liver could do its function of the metabolic regulation, any possible detox that's needed. And that hepatic portal vein is the way to deliver nutrient and toxin-rich blood to the liver. And a quick look at that in terms of toxins. Let's just take a look at this right here. Let's take that in. And one of the major functions of the liver, of course, is detoxifying the blood. However, with too much excessive amounts, chronic use and abuse can lead to the ultimate damage to the liver. So what we're seeing here is a buildup of scar tissue and ultimately what's known as cirrhosis. Okay. So now moving on to the next organ, the gallbladder, as we said, is simply a storage pouch for the bile, the very same bile that's produced by the liver. And we'll just notice here there's a number of duct structures between the liver, the small intestines, but also those same duct structures lead right into the gallbladder as well. So when the muscular valve is closed, that prevents the flow of bile into the small intestines, and it could just now, of course, build up and flow into the gallbladder for storage, as well as water is removed to make it more concentrated, more potent. And to see the connection between those different duct structures, we're just spelling it out here. So with the liver, ultimately, there's the various hepatic ducts which merge together to form a common hepatic duct, following the arrows to a common bile duct, leading into that, again, short but very important part of the small intestines, the duodenum. But also, of course, with the valve junction closed off, that could lead now to the storage via the cystic duct to carry bile into the gallbladder. And when that valve opens, again, that stored concentrated bile from the gallbladder could flow back following the arrows to be released into the duodenum. So we're seeing how we have that connection between the various duct structures here, the biliary duct structures. And that leads us to the third one, the final accessory organ we'll look at for now, is the pancreas. So we do see this position posterior to the stomach. So this is along the posterior portion of the abdominal cavity, the location of the pancreas. And the pancreas, you notice here, This single organ is responsible for a large amount of our digestive glandular function. So most of the pancreatic tissue, most of the pancreatic cells function with the production of digestive enzymes and factors. And collectively, all of our pancreatic factors are known as pancreatic juice. And this pancreatic secretion, once again, flows into that small yet important section of the small intestines. Again, the first few inches known as the duodenum. And that occurs through secretion passing through the pancreatic duct, which leads right into that duodenum once more. And this single organ, the pancreas for our digestive system, this single organ produces the majority of the digestive enzymes. So the majority of our chemical digestion is coming from this small yet vital organ. And just as a note for now, the pancreas does have a second function, and that occurs with the production of insulin and glucagon hormones as well. So it has both a hormonal endocrine function, but for now our focus is on the digestive, the enzymatic activity that's produced. So this is just a nice illustration putting things together. It's not from our textbook, but you notice we have the liver, of course, the biliary ducts, and the gallbladder in particular. We see the pancreas, and now we can see a labeling of the pancreatic duct. And then finally, here's that duodenum of the small intestines. So we notice that from the bile ducts of the liver, bile and bile salts could drain to the duodenum. Stored bile could drain from the gallbladder into the duodenum. And what's referred to as pancreatic juices passing through the pancreatic duct, once again, of course, allowing for drainage into the duodenum. So this small duodenum here is receiving the contents of our stomach and so many different sources of digestive enzymes. So all coming together here at the duodenum and now allowing for the large amount of absorption that occurs at the jejunum. And another final image to wrap up with here. We see a specimen here from a cadaver dissected out, and we can see the length of the entire alimentary canal truly stretched out, so we could appreciate the length of that tubing. So here I am pointing at all of this long unraveled section of small intestines. And again, all of that would be neatly coiled up within the abdominal cavity, protected by the serous membranes, the tunica serosa, the parietal peritoneum. That length allows for just large amounts of absorption in each section. The internal ridges within the internal surface area, of course, increases that ability for surface area. And moving from the distal end of the small intestines, moving on to the large intestines. So a much shorter but larger diameter tube. And the timing that you see here, this is just an interesting note about the amount of time it can take for material to pass through the length of each segment. And of course, this transit time is highly dependent upon our diet. So which foods we consume, what we choose to have in our diet, has a major effect on the amount of time that it takes to pass through the entire system.